What if the greatest military breakthrough of the Second World War didn't come from a new weapon, but from a single commander's willingness to ignore every order he received and trust his instinct that velocity mattered more than permission? On the morning of July 28, 1944, along the blood-soaked hedgerows of Normandy, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stood at the edge of a decision that would redefine modern warfare forever. The Allied advance had stalled into a brutal, grinding war of attrition, where every field cost hundreds of lives and every village took days to capture. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had designed a meticulous, methodical plan called Operation Cobra, meant to break through German defenses near St. Lo through overwhelming firepower, followed by careful, coordinated infantry advances. But Patton, commanding the newly activated Third Army, saw something everyone else missed. The Germans weren't just defending, they were desperately trying to reorganize. And in that chaos lay a window measured not in days but in hours. He understood that the textbook approach, the safe approach, the obedient approach, would allow the enemy time to recover, to dig in, to turn France into another endless slaughter like the trenches his generation still remembered from the First World War. The doctrine drummed into every officer at West Point emphasized coordination, supply lines, flanking protection, and above all, adherence to the operational plan approved by higher command. Yet standing there, watching the first cracks appear in the German defensive line as American bombers finished their devastating carpet bombing runs, Patton made a calculation that would have gotten any other general court-martialed. He decided that speed, pure relentless speed, could accomplish what firepower and obedience never could. If you've ever wondered how one man's defiance changed the course of history and saved countless lives by breaking every rule in the book, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button to help others discover this story. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that sometimes doing the right thing means disobeying orders, and leave a comment telling me which part of Patton's story you never knew before. Because what happened next in the summer of 1944 would prove that the greatest act of loyalty to your mission might be betraying your instructions. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, into a family that worshipped military glory with an almost religious fervor. His grandfather had fought for the Confederacy. His father filled his childhood with tales of cavalry charges and battlefield honor. And young George grew up in Southern California, believing he was destined to become a warrior of historical significance. He struggled with dyslexia, requiring extra years to master reading and writing, but he compensated with photographic memory and an obsessive study of military history that would eventually make him one of the most educated tacticians in the American Army. At the Virginia Military Institute and later West Point, where he graduated in 1909, Patton became known for two contradictory traits: absolute adherence to military discipline and uniform regulations, and a wild, almost reckless aggression in tactical exercises that unsettled his instructors. He represented the United States in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishing fifth, then traveled to France to study sword techniques with the French cavalry, designing a new saber that the U.S. Army adopted. When America entered World War I in 1917, Patton volunteered for the newly formed Tank Corps, becoming one of the first American officers to command armored units in combat during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918. He was wounded by machine gun fire near Cheppy, France, on September 26, 1918, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross for his bravery, but more importantly, he learned a lesson the generals around him ignored. Tanks succeeded not through careful coordination with infantry, but through speed that outpaced the enemy's ability to respond. The interwar years frustrated Patton terribly as the Army reduced in size, relegated tanks to infantry support roles, and promoted officers who excelled at paperwork rather than battlefield innovation. He studied Clausewitz, Napoleon, Caesar, and Hannibal, filling notebooks with observations about mobility, morale, and the psychological collapse that occurs when an enemy loses the initiative. By the time World War II began in Europe in September 1939, Patton was 54 years old, a colonel with a reputation as brilliant but difficult, someone who inspired men through profane speeches and personal courage but terrified superiors with his contempt for caution. His chance for redemption came in North Africa, where in March 1943 he took command of the demoralized Second Corps after the American humiliation at Kasserine Pass, and transformed them in weeks through iron discipline and aggressive patrolling. He slapped 2 soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD in August 1943 in Sicily, incidents that nearly ended his career and revealed the dark side of his leadership. Patton believed so completely in forward momentum and warrior spirit that he couldn't comprehend psychological wounds, viewing them as cowardice rather than injury. Eisenhower, his old friend from their days together between the wars, protected him because he recognized what few others did. Patton's aggressive instincts, properly channeled, could shorten the war and save lives, even if his methods violated every principle of modern military personnel management. The slapping incidents kept Patton sidelined for months, relegated to commanding a phantom army in England, designed to fool German intelligence into believing the D-Day invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy. He spent those months in an agony of inactivity, watching younger generals lead the invasion on June 6, 1944, while he remained behind giving speeches to non-existent divisions. The official activation of his Third Army came on August 1, 1944, but Patton had been in France since July 6, ostensibly as an observer, but actually positioning himself to understand the battlefield reality that would determine his approach. What he observed horrified him. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient hedgerows forming natural fortifications every 100 yards, had turned the Allied advance into a meat grinder where American, British, and Canadian forces measured progress in yards per day, while casualties mounted into the tens of thousands. General Omar Bradley, now commanding the 12th Army Group and technically Patton's superior despite being junior to him in experience, had designed Operation Cobra to break this stalemate through concentrated bombing followed by infantry advance, with armor following behind to exploit any breakthrough. The bombing began on July 24, 1944, but had to be cancelled due to poor weather after some units had already dropped their payloads, killing and wounding over 600 American soldiers in one of the worst friendly fire incidents of the war. Patton, watching from his forward headquarters, raged at the caution that had led to this disaster. The coordination requirements that meant bombers couldn't adjust to ground conditions. The committee-designed battle plan that left no room for initiative or adaptation. The bombing resumed on July 25 with devastating effect, dropping over 4,000 tons of high explosives and napalm on a 5-mile-wide corridor, pulverizing German positions and creating an unprecedented opportunity for breakthrough. But the plan called for infantry to advance first, secure the bombed area, consolidate positions, bring up supplies, and only then commit armored divisions for the next phase, probably days later. Patton recognized immediately that this approach, this obedient adherence to doctrine, would waste the one advantage the bombing had created: German confusion and organizational collapse. On July 28, as Major General J. Lawton Collins' 7th Corps reported that resistance was crumbling and German units were retreating in disorder, Patton made his move without waiting for Bradley's explicit authorization. He ordered Major General John Wood's 4th Armored Division to advance at maximum speed toward Coutances, not stopping to clear every pocket of resistance, not waiting for infantry to secure their flanks, not pausing to establish supply depots according to the logistical tables. Wood, one of the few division commanders who shared Patton's philosophy of armored warfare, understood instantly and pushed his tanks forward 30 miles in 24 hours, a pace considered impossible in the bocage terrain. When German commanders tried to establish new defensive lines, they found American armor already behind them, cutting roads, destroying headquarters, creating panic that spread faster than any tactical retreat could manage. Bradley, confronted with Patton's initiative after the fact, faced a choice: reprimand his most aggressive general for violating the operational plan, or authorize what was already happening and take credit for the breakthrough. He chose the latter, and on August 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army officially entered the battle with orders that reflected Patton's philosophy rather than standard doctrine: advance at maximum speed, bypass resistance, keep moving. Within 72 hours, the German defensive line in Normandy didn't just break, it evaporated. The German 7th Army, which had held the Allies to a crawling advance for 2 months, suddenly found itself encircled at Falaise as Patton's armor raced south to Avranches, then east toward Le Mans, moving so fast that German intelligence couldn't track his positions accurately enough to mount counterattacks. Hitler, refusing to authorize retreat, ordered a desperate counteroffensive at Mortain on August 7th, sending 4 panzer divisions west to cut off the American breakthrough and restore the front line. Patton, monitoring ultra-intelligence intercepts of German communications, knew the attack was coming and recognized it as a gift. Every German tank committed to attacking west was a tank that couldn't escape the developing encirclement. He convinced Bradley to let the Mortain attack develop while Third Army continued its sweeping advance eastward, turning what could have been a dangerous crisis into the opportunity to trap the entire German force in France. The Falaise Pocket, as it became known, closed on August 21, 1944, trapping approximately 50,000 German soldiers and destroying the combat effectiveness of multiple divisions, but thousands escaped through the gap before it fully closed, leading to decades of controversy about whether Patton should have been allowed to close the pocket from the south, while Montgomery closed it from the north. Patton's own view, expressed with characteristic profanity in his diary, was that the cautious coordination between American and British forces had allowed the enemy to escape when speed and disregard for boundaries would have ended the war in France weeks earlier. But even with the partial German escape, the results spoke for themselves. In 3 weeks, Third Army had advanced over 400 miles, liberated vast swaths of France, and transformed the war from stalemate to pursuit. You're watching the moment when warfare changed forever, when one general proved that velocity creates its own protection and that the enemy's confusion is worth more than your own perfect preparation. So if this story is changing how you think about leadership and decision-making, subscribe to this channel right now, smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs to understand that calculated risk beats careful planning, and comment below about which aspect of Patton's philosophy surprises you most, because we're only halfway through this story and what comes next reveals both the power and the terrible cost of his approach. The advance from Normandy to the German border in August and September 1944 became the closest the Allies came to ending the war in 1944. And it was Patton's Third Army that made it possible through a campaign of movement unprecedented in modern warfare. His divisions crossed the Seine River, liberated Paris on August 25th, though the honor was given to the French 2nd Armored Division for political reasons, and by early September had reached the Moselle River, covering in 1 month the distance that had taken 4 years of trench warfare in World War I. Patton's method was simple in concept, but revolutionary in execution. He used reconnaissance units to find weak points in German defenses, then pushed his strongest armored formations through those gaps at maximum speed, leaving bypassed German units to be mopped up by following infantry, while the tanks raced ahead to the next objective. He violated every principle of maintaining secure flanks and consolidated supply lines, operating on the theory that a fast-moving army in the enemy's rear is safer than a slow-moving army with protected flanks, because the enemy can't organize a coherent response to what they can't predict or track. His supply officers performed miracles, scrounging fuel and ammunition from other units, establishing supply dumps based on captured German stocks, and running truck convoys in continuous loops that would have been declared impossible by any logistics manual. But fuel became the choke point that even Patton's aggression couldn't overcome. The Allied supply system still depended on the Normandy beaches and the single port of Cherbourg, with every gallon of gasoline and every artillery shell trucked hundreds of miles to the advancing armies through the famous Red Ball Express convoy system. Eisenhower, now commanding from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, faced an agonizing strategic decision in early September: concentrate scarce fuel and supplies on one army for a single thrust into Germany, or distribute resources more evenly among all advancing forces for a broad front approach. Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group in the north, argued passionately for a concentrated thrust through the Netherlands and into the Ruhr industrial region, promising that with adequate supplies he could end the war by Christmas. Patton, commanding 3rd Army in the center, argued with equal passion that his army was already positioned to cross the Rhine, that German resistance was collapsing, and that if 3rd Army received priority on fuel they would be in Frankfurt and beyond before the Germans could reorganize. Bradley, caught between his 2 most aggressive commanders, tried to maintain some balance while protecting American interests against what he saw as Montgomery's tendency to oversell British capabilities. Eisenhower, carrying the political burden of maintaining the Anglo-American alliance while also commanding the military campaign, made a compromise decision that pleased no one. He authorized Montgomery's Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault to capture bridges in the Netherlands, while also allowing Patton's 3rd Army to continue advancing toward the Saar region. But neither army would receive enough supplies to fully execute their plans. Patton's fuel allocation was cut dramatically on September 2, 1944, and his advancing columns literally ran out of gas within sight of objectives that would have taken hours to capture. He raged, he begged, he diverted supplies meant for other units, and he even considered resigning. But the fundamental mathematics of logistics defeated even his aggressive leadership. The Germans, given this crucial pause, rushed reinforcements to the western border, established defensive positions along the Siegfried Line, and transformed what had been a rout into a renewed stalemate. Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17, 1944, failed catastrophically at Arnhem, proving that Montgomery's confidence had exceeded reality. While Patton's Third Army ground forward in brutal fighting through the fortified cities of Metz and Nancy, gaining miles at the cost of thousands of casualties. The speed that had characterized August was gone, replaced by the kind of attritional warfare Patton despised. And he blamed Eisenhower's caution and Montgomery's influence for what he saw as a thrown-away opportunity to end the war in 1944. History would debate this endlessly. Could a single concentrated thrust have succeeded where the broad front approach led to months of additional fighting? Or were the logistical realities simply insurmountable regardless of command decisions? What remains undebatable is that Patton's August campaign demonstrated a fundamental principle that would influence military thinking for the next 80 years. In mechanized warfare, tempo and speed create tactical advantages that can compensate for numerical inferiority, logistical challenges, and even strategic mistakes. The Israeli Defense Forces would study Patton's campaigns obsessively, applying his principles of deep, rapid armored penetration in the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The U.S. Army's air-land battle doctrine of the 1980s, designed to defeat Soviet armored forces in Europe, explicitly incorporated Patton's emphasis on speed and disruption of enemy command structures. Even in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when the 3rd Infantry Division conducted its Thunder Run into Baghdad, the operational concept echoed Patton's 1944 philosophy. Move so fast the enemy can't establish coherent defenses, accept risk to flanks and supply lines, and exploit psychological collapse as much as tactical advantage. But Patton's methods also carried costs that his admirers often minimize. His divisions suffered higher casualty rates than more cautious commanders because his philosophy of continuous attack gave soldiers no rest and gave tactical commanders no time to properly prepare for each objective. His disdain for logistics led to supply crises that immobilized his units at critical moments, and his willingness to bypass enemy strong points sometimes left dangerous forces in his rear that required bloody combat to eliminate later. Most troubling, his emphasis on speed and aggression as measures of military virtue made him incapable of understanding or accommodating the psychological casualties of combat, as demonstrated by the slapping incidents, and his continued resistance to recognizing battle fatigue as a legitimate medical condition. The winter of 1944 to 1945 tested Patton's philosophy in ways the summer campaign had not. When Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive on December 16, 1944, creating the crisis known as the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower called an emergency conference at Verdun on December 19 to coordinate the Allied response. While other commanders discussed the time needed to shift forces northward to contain the German breakthrough, Patton shocked the room by promising to attack north with 3 divisions within 48 hours, a logistical and tactical feat that every other general considered impossible. He had already, without authorization, begun planning for such a contingency, positioning his headquarters staff to issue movement orders the moment he received approval. On December 22, 1944, elements of Third Army began their attack into the southern flank of the German salient, and by December 26, Patton's 4th Armored Division had broken through to relieve the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, executing a 90-degree change of operational direction, involving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles across icy roads in the middle of winter. It was a masterpiece of military staff work, combined with aggressive tactical execution, possible only because Patton had trained his entire command to prioritize speed over perfect preparation. The Bulge was contained by early January, then reduced through February, with Third Army playing a crucial role in destroying German forces that could never be replaced. Yet even in this triumph, Patton's impatience showed. He wanted to let the German penetration develop further before cutting it off, encircling even more enemy forces in a larger pocket, while Eisenhower and Bradley preferred the safer approach of containing than reducing the salient. Patton believed, probably correctly, that his approach would have shortened the war by weeks and saved Allied lives, but it would have involved greater immediate risk and required other commanders to trust his judgment over their own caution. This encapsulated the central tension of Patton's career. His instincts were often strategically sound, but they required other people to take risks based on his confidence. An institutional military culture is designed specifically to prevent that kind of personalized decision-making. As Third Army crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and drove deep into Germany in April, the war entered its final phase, and Patton's aggressive pursuit became less strategically relevant because the German military was collapsing on all fronts. He wanted to push toward Berlin, toward Prague, toward Vienna, but Eisenhower, operating under political directives from Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff, had already conceded those objectives to Soviet forces in accordance with Allied agreements about occupation zones. Patton's fierce anti-communism, which would become more prominent in his final months, made him advocate for continuing into Czechoslovakia and beyond, but these were political decisions far beyond his authority. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Patton's Third Army deep in Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, having advanced further and faster than any Allied force, but stopped short of objectives that would soon fall behind the Iron Curtain. Patton's tragedy, if it can be called that, was that his greatest skills became less valuable as military victory gave way to political occupation, and his inability to transition from warrior to administrator became increasingly apparent. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria in May 1945, a role utterly unsuited to his temperament and abilities, and within months had created controversy by employing former Nazi Party members in administrative positions because he prioritized governmental function over denazification policy. His public statements comparing Nazi Party membership to Republican or Democratic Party membership in the United States created a political firestorm that led to his removal from the governorship in October 1945. On December 9, 1945, Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany, breaking his neck in a low-speed collision that suggested either terrible luck or divine intervention, depending on one's perspective. He died on December 21, 1945, from a pulmonary embolism related to his injuries, never returning to the United States he had served so dramatically. His death at 60 years old, just months after the war's end, created a legend unburdened by the difficulties of peacetime adjustment that plagued many wartime commanders. He was buried among the soldiers of Third Army at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, per his wishes, and his grave remains one of the most visited by Americans paying respects to the generation that won World War II. The argument about Patton's place in military history continues 8 decades later, with admirers pointing to his August 1944 campaign as proof that aggressive leadership shortens wars and saves lives, while critics note that his methods worked within a specific context of overwhelming Allied material superiority, and that his personal failings revealed dangerous limitations in judgment and empathy. What cannot be argued is that Patton understood something about modern warfare that most of his contemporaries missed. That the psychological and organizational dimensions of combat can be as important as firepower and numbers, and that an enemy kept constantly off balance through speed and unpredictability cannot execute the kind of coordinated defense that turns battles into stalemates. His insight that speed could replace obedience, that velocity creates safety, that moving faster than the enemy can respond is worth more than moving with perfect coordination, represented a genuine intellectual contribution to military art that influenced doctrine and practice for generations. The moment he committed his armor to pursuit in July 1944, violating the carefully coordinated plan in favor of exploiting enemy chaos, Patton proved that warfare is ultimately about imposing your will on the enemy faster than they can impose theirs on you, and that all the firepower and logistics and planning in the world matter less than the tempo of operations and the initiative to exploit opportunities when they appear. The Third Army's statistics tell part of the story. Over 1.4 million men served under Patton's command during the war, advancing over 1,000 miles in 11 months of combat, inflicting over 1 million enemy casualties while suffering approximately 137,000 of their own, a kill ratio that reflected both the effectiveness of mobile warfare and the terrible human cost of continuous offensive operations. But statistics cannot capture the intangible effect Patton had on the war's duration and outcome. The possibility that his aggressive pursuit in the summer and fall of 1944 shortened the European war by months, and thereby saved tens of thousands of lives, Allied and German civilian alike, by hastening the Nazi regime's collapse. If this story has shown you that leadership sometimes means trusting your judgment over your orders, that speed and decisiveness can accomplish what careful planning cannot, and that the greatest military innovations often come from those willing to break the rules everyone else follows, then honor Patton's complicated legacy by subscribing to this channel, hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who needs to understand that calculated audacity beats timid obedience, and leaving a comment about which part of this story changed your understanding of what leadership really means in moments of crisis. Because the lessons Patton learned in the hedgerows of France about the power of velocity over coordination remain as relevant today as they were on that July morning in 1944, when he decided that winning fast mattered more than following orders.